So, we all know that the word evangelical or evangelicalism really comes from a German root, which is that flows out of the Greek word for gospel. So,
Mm-hmm.
in the German setting, evangelische, the German word
Mm-hmm.
for evangelical, is essentially every Protestant.
Mm-hmm.
So, the church that Luther establishes becomes the state church of Germany is evangelische. And so you can see right there that all of a sudden you have a different understanding of the phrase because you have a state church identified as evangelical, if I'm to anglicize
Mm-hmm.
the phrase. Of course, then you have pietist movements and you have Puritans and other types of streams that all then flow into the United States. So we're an amalgamation of an expression of these different streams of continental and UK based religious experience, religious identity. I think if we were to use the term evangelical, for example, in the United States, in the Black community, we have a
Mm-hmm.
very different understanding and a very different reaction among many of my
Mm-hmm.
friends who are
Mm-hmm.
leaders in the evangelical church. So we should probably delimit the definition even further and say what I described as
Mm-hmm.
revivalist and populist is actually white religious identity in the United States as evangelical. If we were to go to Australia, you have different nuancing there as the way it relates. Typically, however, evangelicals are free church Protestants. That would be the
Mm-hmm.
language often used in Europe, meaning not state church Protestants.
Yeah.
Of course, then you have not the confusion, but the interesting dynamic of evangelically oriented denominations within state churches. So you have
Yeah. For the Anglicans, for example, right?
evangelically postured
Yep.
Lutherans, Evangelische Kirche in Germany, evangelically postured Anglicans. So, no wonder it's amorphous,
Yeah.
right? No wonder it's difficult to come up with a definition. And therefore, the answer to your second question, who gets to decide? Pretty much anybody who wants to gets to
Yeah.
decide what
Yeah.
evangelical means and how they're going to understand the term.
Yeah. Well, so let's put a pin in that, the who gets to decide piece, because there do seem to somewhere, I mean, there are some boundary markers, and we'll come back to that. But the revivalist piece, and so again, I grew up in American white evangelicalism, and so this idea of a personal conversion or this revival kind of thing, I know no other. So what else for real? What else is there? Like, how would other people understand? It's so embedded into the way I think of Christianity.
That's correct.
So what would be a different understandings, not necessarily against, but compared to?
Sure. So if we were to look at those denominational expressions where children are baptized into the household of faith, they're nurtured in the household of faith. Some would create an experience where they confirm baptized identity or baptismal identity. So there are people who grow up knowing that they're Christian with vibrant faith. So they don't
Yeah.
need some type of a personal conversion experience. I'd probably just set off all kinds of theological alarm bells there, but they
Right.
have
We
seen,
can edit. We can edit, Mark. Yeah.
they they see themselves, they look back on their lives, and they've always been Christians. They've always
Yeah.
been those who followed Christ. So I'll give you an example. My wife grew up in a very solid evangelical home, very conservative evangelical home, grew up, went through Awana. She doesn't think back and say, I became a Christian X. So, in
Yeah.
order to have street cred in evangelicalism, she had to come up with some type of later
Mm.
life experience where her childhood religious identity became meaningful to her. So, she thought back to a youth camp that she went to. And in order to have the street cred of a conversion story, she pinpoints that experience as when her faith became real or
Interesting.
she decided to follow Christ as an adult. That's because in our understanding of who we are as evangelicals, we have to have some kind of, if not conversion story, some type of commitment story, or in the Southern Baptist world, a rededication to
Yeah.
Christ, right? So,
Yeah.
and that is really very, again, that's very much a part of our history. The great revivals of the colonial era, moving on into second and third Great Awakening, they were the single most powerful historical reality to create
Hmm.
our identity as evangelicals. And so, like you
Yeah.
and I, we naturally talk about we have a personal relationship with Christ.
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
guarantee you, there are millions of Christians around the world for whom that is a nonsensical phrase.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
outcome of this revivalist, conversionist, if we want to use that language, um, essence of what it means to be Christian is that we have a very individualistic understanding of our faith. You have to have personal faith, not your parents' faith. You have to
Yeah.
have personal faith. And certainly I agree. We all have to have some faith commitment that we make to Christ. But what happens is through the revivalist emphasis, we end up with what can essentially be a churchless Christianity.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
get saved at a campaign, or someone read the
Hmm.
four spiritual laws to you. And so we don't know where church fits into that. Church isn't a mediator of salvation. Church isn't even necessarily, in many people's thinking, a necessary part of Christian growth.
Hmm.
You got your small
Yeah.
group, you got your Bible study, you turn on you can access media, you can grow as a Christian. And in some cases, to be frank, when we would share the gospel with people when I was at university, it was almost as if we were saying your participation, lifelong participation in a church, your identity as a Christian isn't enough. You have to have some type of conversion experience. Sometimes that
Yeah.
was true. Sometimes that sowed a lot of confusion.
Yeah. I would. Yeah. I think I would suggest maybe that voluntarism is another key component of American evangelicalism. Like you said, first and second Great Awakenings and voluntary societies, the forerunner to today's parachurch. I mean, those sprang up during that too. So it's just kind of you choose for yourself, and that includes your expressions of religion or how you receive spiritual. I mean, like you said, you could be saved for all these different and have all these other experiences and never set foot in the door of a church,
Yes.
as we would say, local congregation. So I think,
Yeah.
and that's a piece of American history, I think, as well, that
It
voluntarism.
is certainly individualism, voluntarism. However, we need to be clear that as evangelicalism grows and develops and changes into the 20th century, we have the emergence of a more conservative expression of evangelical faith that we
Yeah.
classify as fundamentalism. And in that expression of evangelical faith, participation in, adherence to,
Hmm.
compliance with the, the structures of a local church become essential, right? So there are
Yeah.
strong boundaries drawn around who's a true believer, who isn't. And so in fundamentalism, where uh, control is a dominant value, you
Hmm.
create these belief boundaries as well as behavioral and sociological boundaries. And if you step across those, you're out. So there is
Yeah.
more of a church focused identity in the
Yeah.
fundamentalist expression of evangelicalism.
Yeah. I remember it being a huge aha for me, having grown up in all of mainstream evangelicalism. I mean, I listened to, my family. There was Insight for Living on the radio. I went to Awana. I had all the voluntary, the different I went to Campus Life. I went to a Christian college. I went to Denver Seminary. All these.
Yep.
And so I steeped in this. I did. It was the water. I couldn't see it. It was the water I swam in. And to realize that there were people could be Christian and not evangelical.
Mm-hmm.
Was it was mind blowing
Mm-hmm. Yep.
for to me for that.
Well, I think it's
Well,
also, if I may add one more
go
thing,
ahead. Yeah.
when we typically use David Bebbington's nomenclature to define evangelical belief,
Mhm.
and essentially the church is absent in that nomenclature.
Yeah.
That's not Bebbington's bias. That's what he observes historically.
Yeah.
And remember, he's writing about the 19th century expression of evangelicalism.
Yeah.
So this churchless Christianity, personal conversion, these are, I think, are strong markers, which again leads me to think more of a populist, revivalist
Yeah.
movement, religious movement as a way to think about evangelicalism.